Hello, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. You found your way to a quiet corner of the internet where science drifts softly through your ears, and curiosity floats like a feather on a gentle breeze. Whether you're already tucked under the covers, or simply looking for something soothing to round off your day, I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're going to take a slow, thoughtful journey through deep time. Far beyond the boundaries of history, beyond even the age of the dinosaurs, to explore the 5 great times the world nearly ended. These were not just bad days or rough centuries. These were full-scale global catastrophes, reshaping life on Earth in ways almost too vast to imagine. But don't worry, we'll keep things calm and cozy, even if the planet is metaphorically on fire. If you're new here, please consider giving this video a gentle like and tapping that subscribe button. It really helps keep the channel going, and it lets me know you enjoy this kind of slow, relaxing storytelling. If you'd like, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always lovely to see how far and wide this sleepy little community stretches. Now, I should probably offer a soft warning. I do hope this video doesn't keep you up all night out of sheer interest. But if it does, well, at least you'll walk away with a head full of facts about mass extinction. So as if your pillow's fluffed and the lights are dim, let's begin. We'll glide gently across the layers of ancient Earth and listen for the whispers of long-lost worlds, of trilobites and ammonites, giant dragonflies and lumbering lizards, and the strange, persistent rhythm of extinction and rebirth. Please note, this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not intended as medical advice or a sleep aid recommendation. Always consult a healthcare professional for any sleep concerns. Long before the dinosaurs, before forests whispered in the wind or insects buzzed across the land, Earth was a very different place. If you were to step out of a time machine into the Ordovician period, you wouldn't find yourself on dry land at all. Not because you missed the mark, but because land, for the most part, was barren and lifeless. The real party was underwater. The Ordovician period began roughly 485 million years ago, and what a time it was for the oceans. Vast, shallow seas covered much of the planet's surface. These weren't empty blue deserts, but warm, bustling ecosystems teeming with life. Coral-like organisms formed the first primitive reefs. Brachiopods clung to seafloor rocks, filtering water through their tiny shell valves. Trilobites, those hard-shelled, many-legged icons of ancient oceans, scuttled across sandy bottoms like prehistoric Roombas. Nautiloids, some as long as a small car, drifted through the water like ghostly torpedoes, propelled by jets of water and guided by clusters of eager tentacles. This was an age of experimentation in marine life. Evolution seemed to be trying out all sorts of ideas, some of them successful and others less so. You had creatures that looked like underwater pineapples, sea lilies anchored like organic wind turbines, and jawless fish with nothing but armour and attitude. It was one of the greatest periods of biological diversification in Earth's history, often called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. Over just a few tens of millions of years, the number of marine genera, that's the taxonomic level above species, more than tripled. Life was good, if you were a mollusk or a filter feeder or a tentacled predator. The temperatures were balmy, the oceans were rich with nutrients. The continents, which were mostly clumped into a southern landmass known as Gondwana, were slowly drifting across the globe. The poles were relatively warm. There were no birds in the sky to drop unpleasant surprises, and no footprints in the sand because, frankly, there weren't any feet yet. It was an alien world, but in its own way, a thriving one. And then, just as things seemed to be hitting their biological stride, the music stopped. What followed was Earth's first known mass extinction. It was a sudden, chilling reminder that no matter how vibrant life becomes, it is always at the mercy of a planet that doesn't mind starting over. This particular crisis came in 2 crushing waves, and by the end of it, over 85% of marine species had vanished from the fossil record. Whole ecosystems collapsed. Coral reefs withered. Species that had flourished for millions of years simply disappeared, leaving only silence in the shallow seas. So what happened? Well, as with most extinction events, there isn't one single villain twirling a geological moustache. But scientists are fairly confident that climate played a starring role, or more precisely a dramatic shift in climate. Toward the end of the Ordovician period, Earth experienced one of the most severe ice ages in its long history. The warm, stable temperatures that had made marine life so successful began to plummet. And they did so relatively quickly, geologically speaking. This sudden cooling wasn't caused by a single trigger, but rather a complex combination of factors. One major suspect is the movement of Gondwana. As this supercontinent drifted over the South Pole, large land areas began to accumulate snow and ice. With enough snow cover, sunlight started reflecting more and more off the planet's surface, a process called the albedo effect, which led to even more cooling. A feedback loop was set in motion, and Earth's thermostat began sliding into the freezer. At the same time, there may have been a drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Plants had not yet colonized land in large numbers, but even microbial activity and the chemical weathering of rocks could draw down CO2 over long periods. Less carbon dioxide in the air meant less greenhouse gas to trap heat, and that meant cooler global temperatures. This combination of moving continents and falling CO2 created the perfect storm for a planetary chill. As glaciers began to grow at the poles, global sea levels fell dramatically. Remember those vast, shallow seas that had nurtured all that Ordovician life? They began to vanish. As water turned to ice and was locked up in glaciers, the shallow coastal habitats, the cradles of biodiversity, dried out. Imagine entire oceanic neighborhoods evaporating like puddles on a hot sidewalk. Species that had never known a world beyond warm, shallow waters suddenly found themselves stranded, exposed, or forced to adapt to colder, deeper conditions. But that wasn't the end of the story. After a period of icy desolation, Earth began to warm again, rapidly. The glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and the environment changed once more. This shift wasn't exactly a return to normal. It was more like a second punch after the first had knocked the wind out of life. Species that had managed to survive the initial cooling now faced new pressures. Warming waters, changing ocean chemistry, and an influx of nutrients that may have led to widespread anoxic conditions, that is, parts of the ocean losing oxygen altogether. When oxygen levels drop in the ocean, it becomes difficult, or impossible, for most marine animals to survive. These low oxygen zones are deadly, and during the late Ordovician, they likely spread across large areas of the seafloor. Creatures adapted to stable conditions were hit hard. Those unable to migrate or tolerate the changes perished. It's worth noting that these environmental shifts happened over tens to hundreds of thousands of years. A blink in geological time, but still long enough for life to struggle, suffer, and vanish in wave after wave. The fossil record paints a bleak picture. Whole groups of trilobites gone, coral-like organisms decimated, echinoderms, the ancestors of modern starfish and sea urchins, reduced to scattered survivors, and then silence, or at least something close to it. After the dust settled, or rather, after the glaciers retreated and the oceans refilled, the ecosystems that had once flourished were shadows of their former selves. Recovery was slow. Life did return, of course. It always seems to, given enough time. But the variety and complexity of Ordovician marine life would take millions of years to rebuild. In a sense, the Ordovician Silurian extinction was Earth's first great reset. It showed that even in the absence of asteroid impacts or volcanic cataclysms, the planet's own shifting gears, its drifting continents, evolving atmosphere, and sensitive climate system could upend everything. It reminded us that life is not guaranteed, that even the most stable seeming conditions can unravel with startling speed. Yet it also showed something else. It showed that life, even when knocked to the brink, doesn't vanish entirely. Some species endured the freeze, others survived the flood, and from their fragile clinging lineages, new ecosystems would one day rise. The Silurian period that followed would see jawed fish emerge for the first time. Coral reefs would try again. The oceans, once emptied, would fill once more, and not just with water, but with possibilities. Still, you can't help but imagine the silence that followed. The once thriving reefs now quiet. The trails of trilobites halted mid-crawl. The song of the Ordovician seas, interrupted not by predators or disease, but by the slow, unstoppable machinery of a changing world. And in that hush, something new began. Not just a recovery, but a transformation. Because that's what mass extinctions do. They clear the slate, they reshape the rules, and they remind us, gently and without apology, that Earth has always been the real architect of life's story, rewriting chapters when it sees fit. When you think of ancient Earth, your imagination might drift towards steaming jungles or volcanic chaos. But during the late Ordovician period, the real threat came not from fire, but from ice. For a time, Earth transformed into something far colder than the cozy, ocean-wrapped planet it had been for millions of years. In a twist that caught marine life completely off guard, the warm, shallow seas began to chill, then freeze, and finally vanish as sea levels dropped and glaciers advanced. This sudden descent into global refrigeration triggered one of the deadliest mass extinctions in Earth's history. The question, naturally, is, what on earth caused it? Well, part of the answer begins with Gondwana. Not a mystical kingdom or the name of an upscale candle brand, but a massive supercontinent that was slowly, methodically drifting across the face of the planet. Gondwana was home to what would one day become Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent. During the Ordovician, it wasn't lounging near the equator. Instead, it was headed south, way south, and it was dragging a whole lot of land with it toward the polar regions. Now, the movement of continents is not a fast process. Gondwana didn't pack its bags and head to the South Pole overnight. It took millions of years to make that journey, but once it arrived, things started to get frosty. As land settled over the South Pole, snow and ice began to accumulate. This wasn't just a light dusting. We're talking about full-blown glaciation, thick sprawling ice sheets that reflected sunlight like massive planetary mirrors. That reflective quality is important. When ice and snow cover a large portion of Earth's surface, they bounce sunlight back into space. This reduces the amount of solar energy absorbed by the planet, which leads to further cooling. It's what scientists call a positive feedback loop, though positive here means reinforcing, not necessarily cheerful. More ice meant more reflection, which meant more cooling, which led to more ice. Earth, it seemed, had stumbled into a self-sustaining winter. But continental drift wasn't working alone. Changes in ocean currents and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were also nudging the planet toward the deep freeze. During the Ordovician, volcanic activity had slowed somewhat, meaning fewer greenhouse gases were being pumped into the atmosphere. At the same time, weathering of newly exposed rocks, especially on the rising mountain chains of the time, was pulling CO2 out of the air through chemical reactions. Carbon dioxide reacts with rainwater to form carbonic acid, which then weathers rocks and traps carbon in sediments. It's a natural process, but on a large enough scale it can make a dramatic impact on global temperatures. The result was a drop in atmospheric CO2, and with it a decrease in the greenhouse effect that keeps Earth comfortably warm. This wasn't the kind of climate change you notice in a single human lifetime, of course. These shifts had unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, but for Earth's marine ecosystems, which had flourished in warm, stable conditions, it was like watching the thermostat steadily drop without any way to turn it back up. As the planet cooled, glaciers spread across Gondwana, and sea levels began to fall, dramatically. Those expansive, shallow, epicontinental seas, the warm breeding grounds of Ordovician life, began to retreat as water was locked up in ice. Imagine entire coastlines vanishing as if someone pulled a drain plug on the ocean. Coral reefs were left high and dry. Shelled organisms that depended on gentle tides and nutrient-rich water found themselves exposed to air, unable to adapt quickly enough to survive. But glaciation wasn't the only killer in this unfolding catastrophe. The changing climate also disrupted ocean currents, which in turn affected the circulation of oxygen and nutrients in the sea. The deep ocean, which had always depended on a slow but steady exchange of water with the surface, became increasingly stratified. Warm, oxygen-rich water stopped mixing with the colder, deeper layers. Without that mixing, the deep sea began to suffocate. This process is called ocean anoxia, literally, the absence of oxygen. And it's just as bad as it sounds. Marine animals rely on dissolved oxygen in the water to breathe. When that oxygen disappears, even the hardier species begin to struggle. Whole swathes of the seafloor became uninhabitable. The carbon cycle faltered. Photosynthetic plankton declined, and with them, the entire base of the food chain began to collapse. Then came the flip. After perhaps 1 million years of icy rule, the climate began to warm again. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, but instead of restoring balance, this rapid shift created yet more chaos. The sudden influx of fresh water from melting glaciers may have further altered ocean circulation patterns, reinforcing the low oxygen conditions in the deep sea. Nutrients from eroded land surged into the water, potentially fueling algal blooms that further depleted oxygen as they decayed. It was a kind of planetary whiplash, from freezing to boiling, figuratively speaking, with no time for ecosystems to adjust. The extinction unfolded in 2 distinct pulses. The first occurred during the initial glaciation, when cold temperatures and falling sea levels devastated marine habitats. The second struck during the warming phase, as sea levels rose again and ocean chemistry went haywire. Each wave of extinction left fewer and fewer survivors, like a tide that recedes and then returns to sweep away what's left. The fossil record gives us a quiet but powerful testimony to this collapse. Graptolites, colonial organisms that floated in the ancient seas and were once so abundant they're now used to date Ordovician rocks, virtually vanished. Brachiopods, which had been some of the most successful filter feeders on the seafloor, were reduced to a fraction of their former diversity. Trilobites, those scuttling icons of early marine life, suffered massive losses. Some lineages disappeared entirely, others clung on by the slimmest of threads, and yet despite the devastation, not all was lost. A few hardy species survived, often those with broad environmental tolerances, or those able to shelter in isolated pockets where conditions remained stable. These survivors would go on to repopulate the oceans in the periods that followed. They were, in effect, the seeds of the next chapter in Earth's long biological story. The Ordovician Silurian extinction is sometimes overshadowed by the more dramatic ends met by dinosaurs or Permian fauna, but in terms of raw numbers, it was one of the most severe extinction events in Earth's history. More than 4 out of every 5 marine species were wiped out, and it all happened without a single asteroid or supervolcano, just the slow, steady grind of shifting continents, changing air, and cooling seas. There's something eerie about that, something humbling, reminds us that Earth doesn't need a dramatic flourish to rewrite the rules. Sometimes it simply tilts a little further from the sun, spins its continents toward the poles, and lets chemistry and physics do the rest. Quiet forces, but powerful ones, and deadly to those caught unprepared. Yet in the end, life persisted. The seas never became entirely silent. Some graptolites clung on, a few trilobites kept crawling, and as Earth settled into its new balance, evolution began once again to explore new possibilities. All of it, the ice, the oxygen loss, the rise and fall of ancient seas, is written in the rocks. Layer by layer, fossil by fossil, the story of Earth's first great collapse waits patiently to be read. And in that story, we find not just loss, but a strange sort of resilience. the ability of life to adapt, to rebound, and to flourish once more in a world transformed. In the long, slow wake of disaster, life always seems to find a way to tiptoe forward. After the Earth shivered through its first great extinction, and the oceans finally began to warm, something remarkable happened. Not suddenly, not loudly, but with a gentle persistence that only evolution can manage. Life, despite its bruises, started to rebuild. The Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician, began around 443 million years ago. Think of it as Earth's recovery room, the calm after the storm. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, the shallow seas, once drained and desolate, slowly refilled, and into those renewed waters crept the survivors, hardy, adaptable, and likely none too fussy about where they lived or what they ate. These weren't the flamboyant creatures of the earlier Ordovician seas. They were in many ways the underdogs of evolution. But they had one vital trait in common. They could endure. Simple brachiopods, the bivalve-like creatures that anchored to rocks and filtered food from the current, made a comeback. Crinoids, those elegant feather-armed echinoderms, also returned, waving gently in the currents like aquatic ferns. Trilobites limped on, though their golden age had clearly passed. Among the graptolites, those colonial planktonic scribbles preserved in shale, only a few lineages survived. But those few were enough. From their numbers, the group would diversify once again, radiating out into new forms as the ocean stabilized. The Silurian wasn't just a time of recovery, it was also a time of experimentation, a quiet reshuffling of nature's deck. With so many species gone, entire ecological roles stood vacant. That meant new opportunities for innovation, and slowly but surely, evolution began to play. One of the most exciting developments of the Silurian was the rise of jawed fish. Now, fish had been around for quite a while by this point. Simple jawless varieties with armour-plated heads and bodies like aquatic socks. But jaws were a game changer. Instead of just filtering tiny bits of food or scraping algae from rocks, these fish could grasp, bite, and chew. Suddenly, predation had teeth, literally. The earliest known jawed fish, like the placoderms, made their debut in the Silurian seas. These were bulky, heavily armoured creatures, with bony plates covering their heads and shoulders. They didn't just nibble their way through the water, they were the tanks of the ancient oceans. Their arrival marked a turning point in marine ecosystems. For the first time, complex predator-prey dynamics began to take shape. It was no longer enough to be armoured or slow-moving. If you couldn't swim faster, hide better, or adapt in some clever way, you were dinner. Jawed fish didn't just stop with placoderms. Another group known as acanthodians, sometimes called spiny sharks, also began to appear. These sleek swimmers had lighter armour and fins bristling with spines, early prototypes of what would later evolve into today's bony and cartilaginous fish. From these humble beginnings would come sharks, rays, and every trout, tuna and goldfish the world would ever know. But evolution didn't limit itself to the oceans. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, life also began to creep onto land. The Silurian saw the first tentative steps of terrestrial colonization, not by animals, but by plants. Tiny spore-producing species like Cooksonia started appearing along moist shorelines and riverbanks. They had no leaves, no roots, and definitely no flowers, but they had something just as important: vascular tissue. This allowed them to move water and nutrients through their bodies, which meant they could grow taller and survive in drier environments than their early algal ancestors. It might not seem like much, a few centimetres of mossy green poking above the mud, but it was the beginning of a revolution. These early plants helped stabilise soil, influence weathering, and even impact atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. In time, their descendants would shape entire continents. But for now, they were simply the first whispers of green in a world that had long been blue and grey. The Silurian seas, meanwhile, became more structurally complex. Coral reefs returned, formed not by the modern stony corals we know today, but by tabulate and rugose corals, ancient reef builders with a knack for construction. These reefs provided shelter for smaller creatures and created new ecological niches, adding texture to the recovering marine landscape. This period also saw the return of eurypterids, or sea scorpions, formidable predators with spiked limbs and powerful swimming paddles. Some of them were among the largest arthropods ever to exist, reaching lengths of over 2 meters. Despite their fearsome appearance, they were part of the Silurian revival, living proof that life wasn't just coming back, it was branching into new and spectacular forms. So why do mass extinctions so often lead to bursts of innovation? It's a strange but well-observed pattern in Earth's history. When the dominant species vanish, they leave behind open real estate, habitats with no tenants, food chains with missing links, roles unfilled. In the aftermath of extinction, the survivors often find themselves in a world without competition, without predators, without rules. And in that space, evolution starts throwing ideas at the wall to see what sticks. In a stable world, change is slow and conservative. But in a disrupted one, it becomes bold and experimental. Odd body plans, new ways of feeding, different forms of locomotion, traits that once seemed too risky or unnecessary suddenly become the key to survival. The Silurian period offers a gentle example of this principle. Not a dramatic explosion of life, but a quiet, steady rise of new possibilities. That's not to say the recovery was smooth or instant. Ecosystems take time to rebuild. It took millions of years for biodiversity to return to pre-extinction levels, and even longer for complex food webs to re-establish themselves. Some groups never recovered, others were permanently changed. But taken as a whole, the biosphere proved astonishingly resilient. The lesson, if there is one, is that extinction and innovation are often two sides of the same coin. One clears the canvas, the other picks up the brush. Earth's first mass extinction wasn't the end of the story, just the end of a chapter. What came after was quieter, perhaps, but no less important. The Silurian world was one of rebuilding, rethinking, and reinvention. It's comforting in a way. No matter how many times life stumbles, it seems to find a way to stand back up. It adapts, it reimagines itself. And sometimes, from the ruins of catastrophe, it builds something entirely new. The oceans of the Silurian may not have been as glamorous as those of the later Mesozoic, or as bizarre as the Cambrians, but they hold a special place in Earth's history. They were the waters that cradled recovery. They nurtured the early days of jaws and the first green shoots of terrestrial life. And they whispered, ever so softly, that life, fragile though it may be, is remarkably, wonderfully persistent. The Devonian period had all the makings of a planetary success story. Starting around 419 million years ago, it was a time when life, quite literally, got its feet wet, and then decided to take a stroll onto land. For hundreds of millions of years, the oceans had been the sole stage for evolution's endless performance. But in the Devonian, that story took a bold new turn. Imagine the planet back then. The continents were beginning to resemble something vaguely familiar. Though still shuffled into unfamiliar configurations, massive inland seas sparkled under a warm sun, shallow and rich with nutrients. Green patches began to emerge along coastlines, not just vague mossy mats anymore, but the first forests, built from plants that were finally growing tall. These early forests weren't the kind you might find on a modern hike. They were made up of towering lycophytes, horsetails, and primitive ferns, with thick bark and little in the way of leaves. Some had the look of shaggy poles, all trunk and no flare. Still, they were monumental. Plants had cracked the code of vertical growth. Roots reached deep, stabilizing soil, branches stretched skyward. And with this expansion came something unexpected, a change in the atmosphere itself. More plants meant more photosynthesis, and more photosynthesis meant more oxygen. The air was becoming breathable, for the right kinds of lungs anyway. Insects were among the first to take advantage of this new green frontier. The earliest known terrestrial arthropods were already skittering through damp leaf litter. Millipede-like creatures traced their paths between roots, and primitive wingless insects fed on decaying plant matter. These were small steps, but they signaled a quiet revolution. Life wasn't just surviving on land, it was adapting, diversifying, and learning how to thrive. Meanwhile, in the water, things were even more spectacular. The Devonian seas were crowded with fish, and not just any fish. This was the age when fish got weird, wonderful, and downright dramatic. Jawless fish still existed, but they were quickly being upstaged by their newer, flashier cousins. Plechoderms, heavily armoured fish with crushing jaws, were the Devonians' underwater gladiators. Some, like the massive Dunkleosteus, were apex predators with bone-crunching bites and the fashion sense of a medieval knight. Ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish also emerged during this period, and that distinction would prove crucial. While ray-finned fish would go on to dominate the world's oceans, lakes, and rivers, it was the lobe-finned fish, with their sturdy, muscular fins, that would eventually give rise to the first tetrapods. Evolution was tinkering with limbs, experimenting with ways to move that might just work on land as well as in water. Reefs, too, were booming. This was one of the great reef-building periods in Earth's history. Massive structures, many stretching hundreds of kilometres, were constructed not by modern corals but by stromatoporoids and tabulate corals. These reef ecosystems were rich, diverse, and teeming with life, the rainforests of the sea long before there were any rainforests. It was a golden age in many respects, a time of expansion and opportunity. But golden ages, as history often shows, can be fragile. Beneath all this growth and innovation, a slow-motion catastrophe was beginning to stir. Unlike some mass extinctions that hit like a sudden asteroid or volcanic sucker punch, the Devonian extinction was more of a drawn-out affair. It didn't strike once and vanish. Instead, it unfolded over roughly 20 million years, a complex pattern of ecological stress, extinction pulses, partial recoveries, and renewed collapse. Scientists refer to this drawn-out disaster as a series of pulse extinctions. These were periods when extinction rates spiked sharply, followed by quieter intervals where life attempted to regroup, only to be knocked down again. At least 5 major pulses are recognised within this stretch, and each one took a toll on different groups of organisms. The causes of this long decline are still being pieced together, but several suspects stand out. One of the leading theories points to the forests themselves, or more specifically, to the way that plants were beginning to reshape Earth's surface and atmosphere. As roots dug into rocks and soils, they increased the rate of chemical weathering. This process drew down atmospheric carbon dioxide, cooling the planet over time. In addition, plants stabilised soils, which sounds helpful, but also meant that when heavy rains came, massive amounts of nutrients were washed into the seas. This sudden influx of nutrients likely fueled massive algal blooms in coastal waters. Those blooms, as they decayed, consumed vast amounts of oxygen, creating dead zones in the oceans. Oxygen levels plummeted, especially in deeper waters, and marine life began to suffer. This spread of anoxic conditions may have been one of the primary killers in the Devonian extinction. Entire habitats became uninhabitable, suffocating the reefs and the creatures that depended on them. The reef systems that had flourished earlier in the Devonian all but vanished. After this extinction event, true reef building would not return at a similar scale for another 100 million years. That's a long time for the planet to go without underwater cities. Fish too were hit hard. Many plechoderms went extinct, including some of the largest predators of the time. Lobe-finned fish and early tetrapods saw significant losses, especially near the end of the Devonian. It's thought that the shallow coastal environments they favoured became particularly unstable, fluctuating temperatures, oxygen levels, and salinity making survival a game of chance. Despite the drawn-out nature of the crisis, the long-term effect was clear. Biodiversity dropped significantly. Whole groups of animals were permanently reduced. The complex ecosystems that had developed over millions of years were thinned out, simplified, and left in a state of flux. But, as always, some lineages managed to hang on. Small, generalist species had an advantage. Creatures that could tolerate low oxygen, variable environments, or limited food supplies found ways to persist. Among these were the ancestors of future amphibians, clinging to existence in freshwater margins, and the early arthropods that scurried through detritus both above and below the waterline. What's particularly fascinating about the Devonian extinction is how it reshaped the course of vertebrate evolution. By thinning the ranks of dominant marine predators, it created space for new adaptations, for different kinds of creatures to rise. It didn't immediately usher in something better, but it cleared the field for fresh experiments. Evolution had room to try again. There's something eerie about a mass extinction that takes its time. It feels less like a catastrophe and more like a long illness, the kind where symptoms come and go, sometimes deceivingly mild, other times alarming, until one day you realise the system has changed altogether. The Devonian didn't end in a bang, it ended in a drawn-out wheezing gasp. And yet, within that quiet unravelling, a few strange and hopeful things survived. A stubborn little group of lobe-finned fish, for instance, with bones just sturdy enough to hoist themselves onto muddy banks. In time, their descendants would walk fully on land, breathe air through lungs, and look around at a world still shaken but open for exploration. The Devonian boom, full of promise and potential, ended in a slow bust. But like every fall in Earth's history, it carried with it the seeds of something new. The forest that contributed to the crisis would go on to sculpt entire ecosystems. The tetrapods that clung to existence would one day walk the earth, and evolution, undeterred by setbacks, kept going, one careful step at a time. It's easy to think of trees as gentle giants and stoic, leafy guardians of the land, offering shade, shelter, and that soft rustle of reassurance on a breezy day. But during the Devonian period, trees were new to the world, and like many newcomers, they caused a bit of chaos. In fact, if you were a trilobite trying to enjoy your twilight years on the seafloor, trees might have felt less like wise old sages and more like clumsy environmental saboteurs. Because as it turns out, the rise of forests may have triggered one of the most insidious mass extinctions in Earth's history. Not through fire or brute force, but through roots and rock, and a slow, silent transformation of the world's oceans. Let's rewind to the Middle and Late Devonian, roughly 390 to 360 million years ago. Life on land was still a fledgling experiment. Mosses and liverworts had already crept across damp soils, but now vascular plants were making their big move. These new contenders weren't content to sprawl low to the ground. They were reaching up towards sunlight, up above the competition, and they had the tools to do it. Tough, woody tissues for support, true roots for anchorage, and internal plumbing to move water and nutrients. Among the first true trees was Archaeopteris, a tall, fern-like plant with woody trunks and leafy branches. It could grow over 20 metres high, forming dense stands that resembled forests in both structure and scale. These were not forests in the modern sense, no birds nesting, no squirrels darting between branches, but they were forests nonetheless, and they represented a revolution in terrestrial life. Now, here's where things get interesting. Those roots, digging deep into Devonian soils, began to change the planet. They broke up rock as they grew, a process called biological weathering. As roots pushed into cracks and pores, they released acids that helped dissolve minerals. This breakdown of rock wasn't just good for the plants, providing access to nutrients like phosphorus and calcium. It also had profound effects on the climate in the oceans. When rocks weather, they bind up atmospheric carbon dioxide in a series of chemical reactions. Rainwater, slightly acidic thanks to dissolved CO2, reacts with silicate minerals in rocks to form bicarbonates. These eventually wash into rivers, flow to the ocean, and settle out as carbonates on the seafloor. Over long periods, this process can pull vast amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse effect and cooling the planet. And in the Devonian, with roots suddenly accelerating this weathering process across entire continents, it's likely that carbon dioxide levels dropped significantly. That cooling effect alone would have been enough to disrupt ecosystems, but the real mischief came from what followed: nutrient runoff. As soils weathered and forests expanded, more nutrients, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, were flushed into rivers and carried to the sea. And here's where the ocean, usually a fan of balance, began to tip. When large quantities of nutrients enter marine environments, then they often trigger blooms of algae and plankton. At first, this can seem like a good thing, more food for filter feeders, more photosynthesis. But when those blooms die off, they sink to the bottom and decompose. The decomposition process consumes oxygen. In shallow seas and coastal areas, this can quickly lead to hypoxia, low oxygen conditions, or worse, full-blown anoxia, where oxygen is entirely absent. In the Devonian, this process may have spread far and wide. The fossil record shows clear signs of anoxic black shales forming in various parts of the world's oceans during this time. These rocks, dark and organic rich, are laid down in environments where decay outpaces oxygen renewal. They tell the story of a suffocating sea. Marine life, already dealing with fluctuations in temperature and sea level, now had to face the loss of breathable water. Reefs collapsed, filter feeders vanished. Even mobile animals like fish couldn't outrun the spreading dead zones. It was a slow-motion ecological disaster, and trees, of all things, may have helped write the script. Of course, the trees didn't mean to. They were just doing their tree thing, growing, rooting, breathing, photosynthesizing. There were no sinister plots hatched in the branches of Archaeopteryx, no whispered plans of oceanic upheaval. But when viewed through the lens of Earth systems, their arrival was nothing short of revolutionary. By greening the continents, they set in motion a cascade of changes that altered climate, chemistry, and biology across the globe. In a way, it's the earliest known example of what we might call unintended ecological consequences. A new form of life emerges, reshapes its surroundings, and unwittingly destabilizes the very systems that support it. It's an ancient pattern, and a familiar one. There's a certain speculative humour in all of this. Imagine the conversation in a Devonian reef. "Hey, have you noticed the water's getting a bit murky?" "Yeah, and the oxygen's kind of low. Must be the weather." "Nope, it's the trees." "The what?" It's almost comical that the quiet, leafy rise of terrestrial plants could outmatch the armoured fish and coral reefs in sheer ecological impact. But that's the thing about big changes. They often come not with a bang, but with a root. Interestingly, the effects weren't confined to the seas. The Devonian forests may have also influenced fire regimes. More plant matter on land meant more potential fuel, and with increased atmospheric oxygen, wildfires likely became more common. Charcoal deposits from the period suggest that fire had entered the scene in a serious way. The Earth was becoming more dynamic, more interconnected. Land, sea, atmosphere all woven together in a feedback loop of cause and consequence. The Devonian then becomes a test case. Not for malice, but for complexity. It reminds us that ecosystems are sensitive, and that life, even when it flourishes, can tip the balance of the world in unpredictable ways. Trees didn't destroy the oceans out of spite, they just changed the rules of the game, and the rest of the biosphere struggled to keep up. Yet even with the collapse of reef systems, the loss of marine species, and the spread of anoxic waters, life found ways to adapt. Some organisms moved into deeper, more stable waters. Others evolved strategies to cope with low oxygen. On land, plants continued to diversify, their roots reaching deeper, their forms becoming more elaborate. Insects followed, evolving new behaviours and body plans. The tetrapods, those early four-limbed vertebrates, edged closer to a terrestrial future. It's a fascinating irony. The very forest that helped trigger a marine extinction also created new opportunities for life on land. In the Devonian, crisis and innovation walked hand in hand. What was lost in the sea was, in a strange way, compensated for in the woods. So were trees the villains of this chapter? Probably not. But they do serve as a reminder that even the most peaceful-seeming organisms can change the world in profound and unpredictable ways. They are the original geoengineers, the first terraformers, the quiet revolutionaries who didn't just survive on Earth, they remade it. And in doing so, they taught a valuable lesson that the world is never static, and that life, even when rooted in place, can set everything in motion. In the great Devonian drama of life, the fish were undoubtedly the stars, glittering, armoured, jawed and hungry. But like many celebrity tales, their golden age came with a twist. Some would rise, others would fall, and a few awkward creatures would shuffle their fins onto dry land and become the pioneers of a new world entirely. When the Devonian extinction pulses finally began to ease, the stage was eerily quiet. Whole ecosystems had unravelled. Reefs were gone, oxygen levels in the seas had dropped, and many of the once dominant creatures had vanished. Among the most notable casualties were the placoderms, those jawed, armoured fish that had swaggered through the Devonian seas like aquatic tanks. With their bony helmets and crushing jaws, they had seemed invincible. But as environmental conditions deteriorated and marine ecosystems collapsed, their dominance crumbled. The reasons for their decline are still being pieced together, but like most extinction stories, it wasn't a single culprit. Their large size and specialised lifestyles may have made them less adaptable to sudden changes in oxygen levels, temperature and habitat. When food webs broke down and dead zones spread across the oceans, the placoderms simply couldn't keep up. By the end of the Devonian, they were gone, extinct despite their impressive hardware. Their departure left an ecological vacuum, and into that empty space swam the quiet contenders, the ray-finned fish. Unlike their heavily armoured predecessors, ray-finned fish were lighter, more flexible and far more adaptable. Their fins, supported by bony spines rather than fleshy lobes, gave them agility and speed. They could dart through changing environments, adjust their diets, and exploit niches that the bulkier placoderms had ignored. They didn't look like much at first, small, modest, unassuming. But they were the blueprint for what would become the most diverse group of vertebrates in Earth's history. From humble beginnings, ray-finned fish would go on to fill rivers, lakes, and oceans with a dizzying array of forms, shimmering schools of sardines, lurking anglerfish with luminous lures, sleek swordfish and graceful seahorses. But back in the late Devonian, their advantage was simply this: they could survive. Also clinging to life were the lobe-finned fish. They weren't as nimble as their ray-finned cousins, but they had something special: bones in their fins. These bones provided a kind of internal scaffolding that, in time, would evolve into limbs. One lineage of lobe-finned fish, for reasons that can only be described as ambitious, began to explore the murky margins between water and land. These creatures, the early tetrapods, were not quite fish and not quite amphibians. They had lungs as well as gills. They had fleshy fins with rudimentary digits. They could prop themselves up in the shallows, wiggle through mud flats, and possibly make short excursions onto land to hunt or escape predators. It wasn't glamorous. No one was sprinting across sunlit meadows, but it was a beginning, one small squelchy step toward life on land. Amphibians, or at least their ancestors, also emerged during this uncertain time. They were closely related to the early tetrapods, and like them, they straddled the divide between water and air. These creatures likely laid their eggs in water, breathed through skin or simple lungs, and navigated a world in flux, a patchwork of swamps, rivers, and damp forests. Their survival strategy was one of flexibility. They didn't need pristine coral reefs or open oceans. They could eke out a living in brackish pools, shallow streams, and freshwater deltas. While the great marine predators vanished, these smaller adaptable vertebrates quietly endured. The late Devonian extinction had created a classic evolutionary bottleneck. Many lineages had disappeared, leaving only a few survivors to repopulate the world. But as history has shown time and time again, such bottlenecks can be powerful engines of innovation. When diversity is low and competition is reduced, evolution gets creative. The survivors of the Devonian weren't necessarily the flashiest or fiercest. They were the most versatile. They had broad diets, wide tolerances for temperature and oxygen, and life cycles that could ride out environmental uncertainty. These were the traits that mattered when the world was unstable. Once the worst of the extinction was over, life began to expand again, gingerly at first, then with more confidence. The Carboniferous period dawned, bringing with it lush, swampy landscapes and an explosion of biodiversity. Plants blanketed the land in dense forests, oxygen levels in the atmosphere soared. Giant insects buzzed through the air, and amphibians flourished in the wetlands. The vertebrates that had survived the Devonian bottleneck now diversified into an astonishing array of forms. But even as they branched out, the mark of the extinction remained. It had filtered out entire evolutionary pathways. It had left a legacy of survival and simplification. And from that lean, stripped-down starting point, new complexity would slowly emerge. The Devonian extinction didn't just wipe the slate clean. It reshaped the very architecture of vertebrate evolution. Without it, placoderms might still dominate the seas, and the awkward little tetrapods might never have had the chance to crawl ashore. Instead, the extinction created space. It granted opportunity, and those who took it would go on to reshape the planet in ways the armoured giants of the Devonian never could have imagined. It's tempting to root for the underdog in these stories. The scrawny ray-finned fish, the flopping tetrapods, the amphibians quietly clinging to pond margins. And maybe that's fair. After all, from those uncertain survivors came the whales, the birds, the reptiles, the mammals. Everything with a spine that ever leapt, walked, soared, or sang owes something to the creatures that weathered the Devonian's slow unravelling. They were the ones who didn't give up, who swam a little further, climbed a little higher, breathed a little deeper. And in doing so, they carried life through one of its darkest hours and into a future filled with promise. Roughly 252 million years ago, the world faced its darkest hour. It wasn't a single bad day or a decade of turmoil. It was a full-blown planetary crisis, an extinction event so severe that it's simply called the Great Dying. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's paleontological shorthand for the worst biological disaster in Earth's history. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill evolutionary hiccup. This was a near-total erasure. Over 90% of all marine species vanished, along with about 70% of land-dwelling vertebrates. Whole ecosystems gone. Coral reefs collapsed. Forests fell silent. Even insects, typically resilient little survivors, suffered enormous losses. It was the kind of extinction that didn't just prune the tree of life. It took an axe to the trunk and started over with a few splinters and stubborn shoots. So what could possibly cause a catastrophe on such a staggering scale? Let's begin with the setup. During the late Permian period, Earth's land masses had come together into one vast supercontinent called Pangaea. It stretched from pole to pole, a single sprawling landmass surrounded by the immense Panthalassic Ocean. This configuration had dramatic consequences for climate and biodiversity. With so much land clustered together, the interior of the continent was dry, seasonal, and prone to extreme temperatures. Vast deserts spread across the middle latitudes. Rainfall patterns were erratic, and many habitats were already on edge before things truly began to unravel. Then came the main event, a massive outpouring of lava and gas in what is now Siberia. This wasn't your average volcanic tantrum. This was the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history. Over the course of roughly 1 million years, these eruptions released enough lava to cover an area the size of modern-day Australia, in layers several kilometers thick. It wasn't just the volume of lava that made it deadly. It was everything that came with it. Volcanic eruptions release carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. In moderation, that's manageable. In Siberian Traps quantities, it becomes apocalyptic. The carbon dioxide levels surged, trapping heat in the atmosphere and driving a relentless warming trend. This wasn't a gentle rise in temperature, it was a greenhouse gas explosion. Ocean temperatures soared by several degrees. Surface waters heated up. The deep sea, once cool and oxygen-rich, became stagnant and suffocating. Sulfur dioxide added its own brand of misery. It combined with water vapour in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, which then rained down as acid rain. Forests suffered. Soils were leached of nutrients. Freshwater ecosystems were poisoned. Life was being assaulted from above and below, but it didn't stop there. As global temperatures rose, an even more terrifying feedback loop may have kicked in. The release of methane from undersea clathrates, icy structures that trap methane gas within frozen water molecules on the ocean floor. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Once released, it would have accelerated warming even further, creating a runaway effect. In short, the planet was cooking itself from the inside out. The oceans, meanwhile, underwent a sinister transformation. As they warmed and circulation patterns changed, oxygen levels plummeted. Vast regions of the sea became anoxic, completely devoid of oxygen. Without oxygen, marine life suffocated. Coral reefs crumbled. Shelled organisms which had thrived for hundreds of millions of years disappeared en masse. Trilobites, long survivors of earlier extinctions, met their final end. Some scientists also believe that the warming oceans began to support blooms of certain types of bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide, a toxic, rotten egg-scented gas. If enough of it escaped into the atmosphere, it could have damaged the ozone layer, exposing life to increased ultraviolet radiation. That would have been, quite literally, salt in the wound. And through it all, the land fared little better. The forest that had covered much of the supercontinent began to die off. Plant diversity dropped sharply, rivers clogged with debris from dying vegetation. Amphibians and reptiles, unable to regulate their body temperatures in the rising heat, suffered enormous losses. Entire groups of animals simply vanished from the fossil record. The end Permian extinction wasn't a quick blow. It unfolded over tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. There were spikes and lulls, pulses of extinction and brief moments of hope, but the overall trajectory was devastating. When it was over, Earth was eerily quiet, and yet some life persisted. Certain burrowing animals, perhaps protected from the worst surface conditions, managed to survive. A few hardy marine organisms clung to existence in isolated refuges. On land, a pig-sized, tusk-faced creature called Lystrosaurus became unexpectedly successful, roaming the broken landscapes in surprising numbers. It wasn't elegant, but it was resilient. And in a world brought low, resilience was the only thing that mattered. What's remarkable is how this event reset the stage for everything that followed. With the extinction of so many dominant species, new evolutionary opportunities emerged. The early ancestors of mammals began to diversify. Archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, birds, and crocodiles, found their opening. The biosphere was bruised and broken, but it was not defeated. The Great Dying stands as a stark reminder of how interconnected Earth's systems really are. A volcanic outburst in one region can alter the chemistry of the oceans, the clarity of the sky, and the future of every living thing. It also highlights how quickly things can spiral out of control when feedback loops, like methane release or ocean anoxias, are triggered. If you ever want a humbling perspective, consider this. Nearly all of life on Earth was once reduced to a handful of lineages by a combination of natural forces. No asteroid was needed, just lava, gas, and time. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, life didn't blink out entirely. It endured, it adapted, and eventually it began again. There's a quiet awe in that survival, in the persistence of genes, of cells, of breath. The Permian-Triassic extinction was Earth's hardest reboot, but from that smouldering wreckage, evolution picked up the pieces and started composing something new, something stranger, bolder, and entirely different. Because as history shows, Earth doesn't fear the end, it just keeps turning the page. There's hot, and then there's Permian hot. The kind of heat that doesn't just make you sweat, but melts landscapes, turns air toxic, and rearranges the very chemistry of life itself. Picture a world where the sky darkens with ash, oceans simmer with heat, and the ground itself opens up in fiery chasms. That, more or less, is what Earth looked like during the peak of the Siberian Traps eruptions, a true vision of hell on Earth, written in fire and stone. The Siberian Traps, despite sounding like a catchy name for a doom metal band, are a vast region of volcanic rock in present-day Russia. But during the late Permian period, they were not just rocks. They were fountains of lava, belching columns of gas and ash into the sky for hundreds of thousands of years. The word traps comes from the Swedish word trappa, meaning stairs, a nod to the step-like layers of basalt formed by successive lava flows. But there was nothing stepwise about the devastation they unleashed. This was flood basalt volcanism on a scale hard to imagine. Not a single eruption, or even a series of volcanoes, but a massive region-wide event that covered over 7 million square kilometres in molten rock. That's more than twice the size of India. Lava oozed across the land, sometimes in slow rivers, other times in sudden explosive bursts. Ash and gas were injected high into the atmosphere, altering climate patterns around the globe. One of the most dangerous byproducts of these eruptions was carbon dioxide. Lots of it. Vast quantities of CO2 were released from the magma itself, and possibly even more from the burning of organic-rich rocks that the lava infiltrated. These contact metamorphic events essentially cooked coal beds and other carbon-bearing rocks, adding even more greenhouse gas to the mix. The result? Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels skyrocketed. With more CO2 trapping heat in the atmosphere, global temperatures soared. Some estimates suggest that average temperatures rose by as much as 8 degrees Celsius. That kind of warming didn't just make for uncomfortable summers, it destabilized the very systems that life depends on. The oceans absorbed much of this heat, and as they warmed, the balance of gases dissolved in the water began to shift. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and as ocean temperatures climbed, oxygen levels plummeted. The deep sea, which relies on a steady supply of oxygen from surface currents and sinking organic matter, became increasingly stagnant. Anoxic zones spread, huge regions where the water was so depleted of oxygen that complex life simply could not survive. These lifeless waters weren't just empty, they were toxic. As oxygen vanished, other types of microorganisms began to thrive. Chief among them were purple sulfur bacteria, strange little organisms that don't need oxygen to survive, and instead rely on hydrogen sulfide, a poisonous gas with the unmistakable stench of rotten eggs. These bacteria have a signature colour and metabolism, and their presence is recorded in ancient rocks from the late Permian. Hydrogen sulfide isn't just smelly, it's lethal. In small amounts, it can make you dizzy and sick. In larger concentrations, it's fatal to most forms of life. In the late Permian oceans, it appears to have built up in staggering quantities. Some scientists believe that this toxic gas even began to bubble up from the sea into the atmosphere, forming deadly clouds along coastlines and poisoning the air. And the trouble didn't end there. Hydrogen sulfide is photochemically active, meaning it reacts with sunlight. In the upper atmosphere, it can break down the ozone layer, the protective blanket that shields Earth's surface from harmful ultraviolet radiation. If the ozone thinned enough, it would have allowed dangerous levels of UV light to reach the surface, damaging plant life, plankton, and animals alike. It's a grim picture. A world overheating, oceans suffocating, poison gas seeping from the depths, and solar radiation scorching the land. Not exactly the kind of planet you'd plan your next vacation to. What's particularly sobering about the Permian-Triassic extinction is how it didn't unfold as a singular cataclysm, but as a slow, rolling disaster. It wasn't a solitary event with a clear beginning and end. It was a cascade, a series of interconnected crises that compounded and reinforced one another. Volcanism drove climate change. Climate change altered ocean circulation. That triggered anoxia, which fostered toxic bacteria, which released gas, which thinned the ozone, which increased UV radiation, all while species tried and mostly failed to adapt. Each step didn't just add a new challenge. It made the existing ones worse. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship while also navigating a storm, dodging icebergs and discovering that the lifeboats were full of snakes. As the biosphere reeled, the chain of extinctions became inevitable. Coral reefs disintegrated, trilobites disappeared, armoured fish and shelled cephalopods fell away. On land, forest ecosystems collapsed. Amphibians with their moisture-sensitive skin couldn't cope with the rising heat. Reptiles, slightly better adapted, managed to survive in small numbers. But even they suffered catastrophic losses. Only a few hardy species made it through. Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized herbivore with a stubby face and strong limbs, somehow became one of the most common land animals in the early Triassic. In the oceans, a handful of mollusks, bony fish, and microscopic plankton scraped by. These were the evolutionary seed stock, the tiny surviving slivers of biodiversity from which the next wave of life would eventually emerge. There's something haunting about this kind of extinction. It wasn't loud or fast, it didn't come from the sky in a fiery blaze. It crept across the planet like a slow fever, unravelling the web of life thread by thread. In some places, it would have been subtle, a change in the colour of the sea, the disappearance of a favourite prey species, a season that came too early or too late. But over time, the signs would build until silence took hold, and yet, from that silence the story continued. Not as a triumphant return, and not yet, but as a quiet persistence. A few survivors, battered and diminished, clung to existence, and given time they would fill the world once more. These Siberian traps remind us that Earth doesn't need a dramatic impact to reinvent itself. Sometimes it just needs a long, angry exhale from deep within its mantle. Sometimes fire is enough. In the wake of the Permian-Triassic extinction, Earth looked like a planet trying to remember how to be alive. The skies had cleared, the lava had cooled, and the oceans had begun to calm. But the biosphere was a shell of its former self. Forests had fallen silent. Coral reefs had crumbled to rubble. Food webs were shattered. Species that had endured for hundreds of millions of years were now gone, and those that remained found themselves in a world eerily empty. By many accounts, Earth came terrifyingly close to full sterilization. It wasn't just a matter of biodiversity declining, it was nearly wiped clean. Some estimates suggest that more than 9 out of every 10 marine species vanished, along with about 70% of vertebrate species on land. There were moments, at least in geological terms, when the light of life flickered perilously low, and yet it did not go out. Among the scattered survivors, one creature emerged as an unlikely monarch of this bleak new world, Lystrosaurus. If you're picturing some regal golden-maned beast rising nobly over the ashes, allow yourself a small chuckle. Lystrosaurus was, well, not that. It was a pig-sized, tusked, and somewhat awkward-looking synapsid. Not quite a mammal, not quite a reptile, but something in between. It had a barrel-shaped body, short, sturdy legs, and a broad, flat face punctuated by a pair of downward-pointing tusks and a beak-like mouth. But looks can be deceiving. Lystrosaurus was a survivor, and in the early Triassic, that counted for everything. Fossil beds from this period are absolutely packed with its remains. In some regions, it accounts for up to 90% of all known vertebrate fossils. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fast, but it was tough, adaptable, and probably unbothered by the collapse of the world around it. Why did Lystrosaurus succeed when so many others failed? Its secret likely lay in its low-maintenance lifestyle. It was a generalist herbivore, capable of living in a wide range of environments and surviving on a variety of tough, fibrous plants. It probably burrowed to escape heat and drought. Its respiratory system may have been unusually efficient, perhaps an early adaptation that helped it survive in the low oxygen conditions that followed the extinction. In other words, it didn't need much to get by. And in a post-apocalyptic landscape, that was a superpower. While Lystrosaurus ruled the land, the oceans were undergoing their own quiet reboot. The diversity of marine life had been reduced to a bare minimum. Many lineages of brachiopods, ammonoids and trilobites had vanished altogether. The once bustling reefs were gone, but life, persistent as always, began to reappear in the form of simple low-diversity communities dominated by hardy species. In many places, microbial mats covered the seafloor, thick carpets of bacteria and other microorganisms that had flourished in the Precambrian world and now found themselves back in the spotlight. These mats were slow-growing but remarkably resilient. They held sediments together, processed nutrients, and provided a basic foundation for the rebuilding of marine ecosystems. In essence, the microbial world stepped back into the role it had once played billions of years earlier, when life was young and the world was still learning how to support complexity. Above the mats, small bivalves and gastropods made a modest comeback. In the open water, a few species of ammonoids, distant cousins of modern squid, re-emerged, their coiled shells once again drifting through the currents. Fish too began to diversify slowly, though it would be some time before marine ecosystems approached anything like their former complexity. Recovery was not quick. It wasn't a triumphant return to form, but a cautious, step-by-step rebuilding. For several million years, biodiversity remained extremely low. Ecosystems were simplified, fragile and vulnerable to disruption. Think of it less as a renaissance and more like fumbling around in the dark, trying to remember where the light switch is. On land, plants returned patchily. The lush forests of the Permian gave way to more sparse vegetation in the Triassic, especially in the hotter and drier regions. Lycopods, ferns and early gymnosperms began to repopulate the landscape, though the diversity of plant life was still quite low. In many areas, the vegetation cover was so reduced that soil erosion became a major issue. Rivers clogged with sediment. Floodplains turned into muddy wastelands. It was a long, hard slog back toward ecological stability. But amidst all this hardship, evolution did what it always does when faced with a blank canvas. It experimented. The extinction had cleared the field of so many dominant players that new forms of life were free to try new things. Archosaurs, for example, began to rise during this period. This group, which includes dinosaurs, crocodiles and eventually birds, found fertile ground in the empty niches left behind. Early mammal-like creatures, the cynodonts, also began to diversify in their own quiet way, laying the groundwork for future furry developments. This evolutionary bottleneck was grim, yes, but it had a twist of hope. Fewer lineages meant fewer options, but it also meant less competition. Survivors could evolve rapidly into new forms, filling ecological roles that had been wiped clean. In time, life would bounce back, not just in numbers but in creativity. The Triassic period would see the rise of entirely new ecosystems, populated by creatures the Permian world had never seen. It's easy to romanticize these moments, to find beauty in the comeback, the perseverance, the rebirth. And in a way, that's fair. The story of life after the Great Dying is one of resilience against all odds, but it's also a sobering reminder of how fragile our biosphere truly is. The interconnected web of life can unravel far faster than it can be rewoven. It took Earth at least 5 to 10 million years to regain anything close to the diversity it had before the extinction. Some argue it took much longer. Still, there is something oddly comforting about the image of Lystrosaurus trudging through the barren plains of the early Triassic, a little pig-snouted ambassador of life's determination to carry on. It didn't know it was part of a planetary recovery mission. It wasn't there to inspire future paleontologists. It was just trying to survive, one mouthful of scrubby vegetation at a time. And maybe that's the real lesson of this chapter in Earth's story. That survival isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's about being unglamorous, persistent, and just adaptable enough to weather the storm. life crawled from the ashes not with fanfare, but with quiet grit. It didn't rebuild the world overnight. It did it inch by inch, breath by breath, through creatures great and small, and through the long, patient work of time. The Permian extinction had left Earth badly bruised but not broken. In the aftermath, life slowly pulled itself together, building new ecosystems on top of the old bones. The Triassic period, beginning about 252 million years ago, was a time of experimentation, resilience, and more than anything else, cautious reinvention. Imagine a world that had forgotten how to be lush, now trying to remember what green looked like, a biosphere learning how to breathe again. As the dust of the Great Dying settled, the survivors began to stretch and grow. The continents were still locked together in Pangaea, the supercontinent that gave Earth an oddly lopsided appearance, one giant landmass dominating the globe, surrounded by the vast, featureless Panthalassic Ocean. The interior of this landmass was arid and seasonal, with blistering summers and frigid winters. Coastal regions, however, offered a bit more ecological breathing room, and it was in these places that life started to gain traction again. Forests of conifers and seed ferns emerged, painting the landscape with muted greens. Insects recovered, and so did the vertebrates. First, the crocodile-like phytosaurs and the heavily armoured atosaurs, then nimble, early reptiles and the first true mammals, small and nocturnal and nervously peering out from under ferns. Among these rising stars were a group of two-legged reptiles with long tails and upright posture, the dinosaurs. But in the beginning, dinosaurs were not kings. They were not thunderous giants or apex predators. They were scrappy little creatures darting through underbrush, trying not to get stepped on or eaten by the older, more established reptiles of the day. Archosaurs ruled the land, with some groups evolving into terrifying predators and others into vast, herbivorous tank-like forms. The crocodile cousins, in particular, were everywhere, dominating both terrestrial and aquatic environments. Dinosaurs may have had potential, but during most of the Triassic period, they were background players. They weren't the biggest, they weren't the fastest. They were just one more evolutionary experiment in a world still testing its options. If the story had stopped there, we might never have known their name. Then came another planetary reshuffle. Because what's a peaceful stretch of evolutionary development without a little mass extinction to stir the pot? Around 200 million years ago, something big happened. Fossil records from across the globe show a sudden and dramatic drop in biodiversity, especially among the dominant non-dinosaur archosaurs and marine reptiles. Insects took another hit, plant diversity shifted, and just like that, the ecological stage was cleared. At the heart of this extinction lies an all-too-familiar suspect, massive volcanism. This time the culprit was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP for short, a vast region of volcanic activity that erupted as the supercontinent Pangaea began to split apart. As North America, South America, Africa, and Europe started to rift away from each other, enormous volumes of magma surged up through the cracks. These weren't short-lived fireworks displays. The eruptions went on for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly even longer, releasing oceans of lava and enormous quantities of volcanic gases into the atmosphere. The result was, once again, a surge in carbon dioxide levels that sent the climate into a tailspin. With rising CO2 came global warming. Atmospheric temperatures climbed, ocean temperatures followed suit, and weather patterns became increasingly chaotic. Rainfall increased in some regions, dried up in others. Seasonal extremes sharpened. The ecosystems that had barely regained their footing after the Permian collapse were now pushed into another crisis. But it wasn't just the heat that proved deadly. The excess carbon dioxide also led to ocean acidification. As more CO2 was absorbed by seawater, it formed carbonic acid, lowering the pH and disrupting marine chemistry. Creatures that built shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, like many mollusks and plankton, struggled to survive in increasingly corrosive waters. Food chains destabilized. Marine biodiversity plummeted. The extinction didn't hit as hard as the Permian, but it was still a major blow. Large reptilian competitors on land vanished. Marine reptiles were thinned out. Many amphibians disappeared. Once again, Earth's ecosystems were pushed to the edge, and once again the survivors would inherit a changed world. And this time the dinosaurs were ready. With the dominant archosaurs out of the picture, dinosaurs quickly spread into the newly vacated niches. They diversified into predators and herbivores, large and small. The nimble little bipeds of the late Triassic began to evolve into the towering sauropods, the armoured stegosaurs, and the sharp-toothed theropods that would later rule the Jurassic. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it was more like a quiet rising tide. Sometimes evolutionary success is about being at the right place at the right time. The dinosaurs weren't necessarily more advanced than their competitors, but they were adaptable, and perhaps more importantly they were lucky. They survived the extinction, they endured the climate swings, and when the ecological curtain lifted, they were the ones left standing. This pattern of extinction followed by radiation is one of the most consistent themes in Earth's history. Life builds, collapses, and rebuilds again, each time with a new cast, new strategies, and new possibilities. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction was no exception. It cleared the way not only for the dinosaurs, but for modern coral reefs, new marine predators, and the early evolution of mammals in the shadows. It also marked the beginning of a new geological era. The Jurassic period dawned with lush vegetation, warm climates, and the slow separation of the continents. Dinosaurs didn't just survive, they flourished, and for the next 135 million years, they would become the dominant force on Earth, shaping ecosystems from the highest treetops to the forest floor. But that future was still waiting in the wings. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, Earth was once again a planet in transition, a place where old lineages had fallen, new ones were rising, and the atmosphere still carried traces of ash and heat from the volcanic fires below. What's fascinating is how, time and time again, life seems to absorb catastrophe and turn it into opportunity. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction could have been the end of another chapter, a closing of the book. Instead, it set the stage for some of the most iconic creatures to ever walk the Earth. Evolution didn't just bounce back. It took a bow and stepped into the spotlight. And standing in the wings, ready for their grand debut, were the dinosaurs, no longer background players, but the headliners of Earth's next great act. In the grand theatre of life, the end of the Triassic extinction served as the dramatic scene change that allowed a new cast to step onto the stage. The old stars had exited, many archosaur relatives, large amphibians, and a suite of strange and fascinating creatures that once filled Triassic ecosystems were now gone, leaving behind a world of open space and silence. And into that silence crept the dinosaurs, ready not just to survive, but to headline. But before the dinosaurs could truly dominate, they were part of a broader, complex group known as the archosaurs, ruling reptiles in more ways than one. Archosaurs were a diverse and powerful lineage of animals that had already begun to shape the land, air and water during the Triassic period. This sprawling group included early crocodile-like creatures, flying pterosaurs, and of course the budding dinosaur clade. In the early days, it was the pseudosuchians, relatives of modern crocodiles, that seemed to be calling the shots. Many were fearsome predators, others were herbivorous tanks covered in armour, and some were aquatic ambush specialists with mouths full of teeth. For millions of years, it looked like the pseudosuchians had the upper hand, but nature has a peculiar way of rewriting the script. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction, brought on by immense volcanic activity and a planet wobbling under the weight of climate change, changed the rules almost overnight. Many of the dominant archosaurs didn't make it through. The forest shifted, the atmosphere churned, and the once familiar rhythms of life faltered. This sudden shake-up cleared out competitors that had previously overshadowed the smaller, scrappier dinosaurs. Where once they had merely survived in the margins, now the margins had become the main event. This moment wasn't about superiority so much as survivability. The dinosaurs that weathered the storm were flexible. both in anatomy and behaviour. They could eat a variety of foods, move across different environments, and reproduce relatively efficiently. They were, in a word, versatile, and versatility in a time of upheaval is priceless. As the Jurassic period dawned, these traits paid off in a big way. Ecological niches that had been occupied for millions of years suddenly stood vacant. Predator roles, herbivore slots, fast runners, forest browsers, swamp waders, empty seats in the great orchestra of life. And dinosaurs, with their upright limbs, efficient lungs, and lightweight but strong skeletons, were well suited to fill them. They did not all look like the towering behemoths we tend to picture today. Many early Jurassic dinosaurs were modest in size. Some, like Colophysis, were slender, bipedal carnivores that hunted in packs or pairs. Others, like Scutellosaurus, were small herbivores just beginning to experiment with body armour. Still others had elongated necks and tiny heads, nibbling at ferns with an elegance that hinted at the eventual rise of giants like Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus. The incredible part is not just that dinosaurs expanded into these new roles, it's how fast they did it. Within just a few million years of the extinction, they were radiating into a remarkable variety of shapes and sizes. Carnivores grew longer legs and sharper teeth. Herbivores evolved heavy armour, spiked tails and intricate chewing mechanisms. Some began walking on 4 legs, others on 2. Some became lithe and agile, others lumbering and massive. It was a creative burst of evolutionary energy fueled by an almost complete lack of competition. Meanwhile, in the background, a different kind of creature was eking out a quiet existence. The early mammals. You might be tempted to picture fuzzy little rodents scurrying under dinosaur feet, and you'd be more or less right, though early mammals were even more modest than that. Descended from snapsids like Lystrosaurus, they had already split off into their own lineage by the time dinosaurs took the spotlight. These creatures were small, mostly nocturnal, and likely insectivorous. They lived in the shadows, quite literally, avoiding the larger, more dominant animals by sticking to the night shift. But that obscurity served them well. While dinosaurs grew to fill every niche in broad daylight, mammals carved out a quiet, durable existence in the underbrush. Their small size allowed them to hide easily, their warm-blooded metabolism gave them an edge in regulating body temperature, and their fur, yes, it probably existed even then, helped them stay warm in cooler climates. They were not evolutionary failures, they were patience embodied. Back in the daylight, the world continued to reshape itself around its new rulers. Dinosaurs dominated not just because they were big or flashy, but because they had time and space to experiment. With fewer competitors, evolution was free to push boundaries. Long necks got longer, beaks began to replace teeth, claws evolved into wings. Some lineages developed hollow bones, while others bulked up with osteoderms and bony plates. The evolutionary tree of dinosaurs exploded into hundreds of branches, many of which we are still discovering today. It's important to recognise that this flourishing wasn't a foregone conclusion. It wasn't inevitable that dinosaurs would become the dominant force on Earth. Their rise came about through a mixture of opportunity, adaptability, and the sheer attrition of everything else. This is evolution by subtraction as much as by invention. The extinction cleared the board, and dinosaurs simply rolled the best dice. In a way, the Jurassic period was less a triumphal march and more a cosmic accident of timing. Had the volcanism that ended the Triassic not occurred, pseudo-Suchians might still have held the throne, dinosaurs might have remained side characters in someone else's story. But the Earth tilted, the climate swirled, and the cards fell differently. And because of that, the age of dinosaurs was born. Their rule would span more than 130 million years, across every continent and climate. From icy polar forests to steamy equatorial swamps, they adapted to it all. They weren't just big, they were clever, responsive, and in some cases, even social. They filled every niche that the Earth could offer. And while their story would eventually end with its own kind of disaster, for now, the curtain had risen. Dinosaurs had taken the stage, and the world would never be the same. As the Triassic period drew to a close and the Jurassic began, the Earth seemed to take a long, steady breath. After millions of years of chaos, of eruptions, extinctions, and evolutionary reshuffling, the planet finally started to settle down. The supercontinent Pangaea was still drifting apart, but the violent volcanic activity that had ripped it open had mostly quieted. The climate, once erratic and punishing, began to mellow. Rainfall increased, temperatures stabilized, and in this newfound calm, life took root once again, only this time it came back bigger. The Jurassic period, beginning around 200 million years ago, marked the rise of lush, fern-covered landscapes, towering conifer forests, and a flourishing of animal life that would make the previous world seem almost quaint. In the open meadows and forested valleys, vegetation blanketed the earth like a green tide. There were no flowering plants yet, no daisies, no roses, no buzzing bees, but the ferns, cycads, and ginkgos thrived, painting the landscape in a palette of deep greens and intricate textures. These plants provided the perfect buffet for a new wave of herbivores, and among them were the largest animals to ever walk the earth, the sauropods. With necks like cranes, tails like whips, and legs like tree trunks, sauropods were nothing short of magnificent. Some, like Diplodocus, stretched over 25 meters from nose to tail. Others, like Brachiosaurus, raised their long necks high into the canopy, calmly stripping conifer branches with peg-like teeth. They moved in slow herds, their massive footsteps shaping the land itself. How these giants grew so large is still a subject of fascination. Part of the secret lay in their physiology, efficient lungs, rapid growth rates, and a metabolism that may have combined the best features of reptiles and birds. But another part was ecological. There was room, there was food, there were no competing large herbivores, and in the warm, stable climate of the Jurassic, the conditions were just right for gigantism to flourish. Predators weren't far behind. Carnivorous theropods like Allosaurus stalked the sauropods, using speed and sharp teeth to bring down the weak or the young. Though not quite as famous as their later relatives like Tyrannosaurus rex, these Jurassic hunters were formidable in their own right, sleek, agile, and perfectly suited to a world of giants. But the action wasn't limited to land. In the oceans, life had also taken a dramatic turn. While dinosaurs were content to rule the continents, other reptilian lineages claimed the seas. Ichthyosaurs, which looked remarkably like modern dolphins despite being reptiles, zipped through the water with streamlined bodies and large sensitive eyes. They gave birth to live young, had excellent swimming abilities, and came in a variety of sizes, from nimble fish chasers to massive leviathans rivaling modern whales. Then there were the plesiosaurs, with their long necks, stout bodies, and flippered limbs. Some had short heads and jaws packed with teeth for catching fish. Others, most famously the long-necked Elasmosaurus types, may have used their elongated necks to stealthily snap up prey in shallow waters. They were the stuff of lake monster legends long before humans ever appeared. The marine food chains of the Jurassic were dynamic and complex. Ammonites, with their coiled shells and tentacled mouths, flourished again after their decline during earlier extinctions. They became key prey for many marine reptiles. Sharks and bony fish also diversified, filling the oceans with motion and noise. Coral reefs, though still primitive by today's standards, began to reappear, supporting ecosystems that buzzed with energy. Back on land, the skies were starting to see new shapes as well. The earliest pterosaurs, flying reptiles with wings of skin stretched over elongated fingers, were taking to the air. Some were small and nimble, flitting over the rivers like oversized dragonflies. Others would grow to wingspans that rivaled modern aircraft in later periods. These were not dinosaurs, technically speaking, but close relatives, and their mastery of flight opened up yet another frontier of ecological opportunity. And then, of course, there were the mammals, still small, still living in the margins, but gradually adapting to a world dominated by giants. They remained mostly nocturnal, feeding on insects, seeds, and possibly small reptiles. These little survivors had been around since the late Triassic, and while they were still minor players, they were quietly experimenting with warm-bloodedness, fur, and parental care. Traits that would one day help them rise to the top of the food chain. The Jurassic, in short, was a time of ecological balance, but not in a static sense. It was balance in motion. Life had filled in the blanks left by the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, and then expanded far beyond them. The tragedy of the earlier era had made space for new forms, and evolution wasted no time in filling it with spectacular variety. What's particularly striking about this period is how well Earth systems seem to be cooperating. Carbon dioxide levels were high but relatively stable, creating a warm and humid climate ideal for plant growth. Sea levels rose, creating shallow inland seas and coastlines that supported diverse marine habitats. Rainfall patterns allowed dense vegetation to spread across much of the globe. Even the continents, though still connected, were beginning to rift apart just enough to encourage regional differences in flora and fauna. In many ways, the Jurassic was the Earth hitting its stride. It wasn't a perfect paradise. There were still predators, droughts, and wildfires, but it was a time of extraordinary equilibrium. Life wasn't just surviving, it was thriving on a scale previously unseen. Forests echoed with the calls of early birds and chirping insects. Plains shook beneath the weight of sauropod herds. Reefs sparkled beneath the waves. And high above it all, pterosaurs glided between mountain peaks, scanning the world below with sharp eyes. The world the dinosaurs inherited wasn't given to them. It was taken, earned, and shaped by extinction and persistence. They rose in the wake of disaster, grew in the absence of rivals, and flourished in a world made fertile by volcanic ash and evolutionary luck. And as the Jurassic unfolded, they became not just survivors, but symbols of an era defined by abundance, scale, and a sense of grandeur that would echo through time, even into the imaginations of distant future mammals watching them from the fossil record. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary day. The Cretaceous period was winding down and the Earth was humming along as usual. Dinosaurs roamed across forests and plains, enormous sauropods lumbering under the canopy while nimble raptors stalked in their shadows. Triceratops grazed in herds, swinging their horned heads as they browsed on tough vegetation. Above, pterosaurs glided on thermals, and early birds flitted through trees filled with flowering plants. The oceans, too, were teeming with life. Mosasaurs prowled the depths, ammonites drifted in spiral shells, and coral reefs shimmered with colour. The world was busy, complex, and alive, and then, in an instant, everything changed. Roughly 66 million years ago, a rock the size of a small city hurtled through space, crossed the atmosphere, and struck the Yucatan Peninsula at a speed of about 20 kilometers per second. That's more than 70,000 kilometers per hour, fast enough to circle the entire planet in under 40 minutes. It's known as the Chicxulub impactor, and it delivered a punch so forceful that it redefined the history of life on Earth. The object itself was about 10 kilometers wide, large enough to make Mount Everest look like a molehill, and when it hit, it didn't just make a crater, it made a statement. The energy released upon impact was equivalent to more than 100 million megatons of TNT. That's over 1 billion times the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In less than a second, rock was vaporized, pressure waves blasted outward, and the crust of the Earth rippled like fabric under strain. The impact crater, now buried beneath layers of limestone and jungle, stretches more than 180 kilometers across, but the real damage extended far beyond that. The initial blast caused earthquakes strong enough to be felt around the world. Shockwaves rippled through the Earth's crust and through the oceans. Superheated debris was ejected into space, some of it exiting the atmosphere entirely before raining back down across the globe like a fiery snowstorm. Those re-entering fragments heated the atmosphere to the temperature of a pizza oven. The friction from billions of falling particles caused a global spike in temperature. A few minutes of searing heat that likely ignited wildfires across entire continents. Forests turned to ash, grasslands vanished in flame, animals caught in the open didn't stand a chance. In coastal regions, the energy from the impact triggered massive tsunamis. These weren't your average storm surges. Some waves may have reached hundreds of meters high, crashing inland and sweeping away everything in their path. Shorelines were obliterated. Marine life was churned in watery chaos. Sediments kicked up by the wave action settled into thick layers that would one day serve as a geological timestamp, the boundary between two worlds. But perhaps the most devastating effect came from what followed. A sudden and prolonged darkness. The Chicxulub impact vaporized large amounts of rock rich in sulfates, which were blasted into the stratosphere. Along with the soot from global wildfires, these particles formed a dense sun-blocking layer in the atmosphere. Sunlight dimmed, and Earth entered a kind of nuclear winter. Photosynthesis faltered, temperatures dropped. The sky may have appeared dusky for months or even years, casting the planet into a long twilight. With the sun obscured, plants began to die. Plankton in the oceans collapsed, and with the primary producers gone, the food web unravelled from the bottom up. Herbivores starved. Carnivores soon followed. The ecosystems that had taken tens of millions of years to evolve came crashing down in just a matter of weeks and months. Dinosaurs, who had once ruled the land with unshakable confidence, found themselves in a world that no longer worked for them. The great plant eaters, like Ankylosaurus and Hadrosaurus, had nothing left to eat. The apex predators, like Tyrannosaurus rex, had nothing left to hunt. The skies, once ruled by pterosaurs with wingspans the size of small airplanes, now held only silence. In the oceans, similar tragedies played out. Ammonites, which had survived multiple previous extinction events, vanished completely. Marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs disappeared. Coral reefs collapsed under the weight of acidic, cooling waters and the loss of symbiotic algae. The once rich tapestry of marine biodiversity faded into a skeletal remnant. Not all creatures perished. Some managed to squeak through the chaos. Crocodiles, for instance, survived, likely due to their ability to live in water, go long periods without food, and hibernate through tough times. Turtles too made it through, as did many small mammals, birds, and certain insects. These survivors were typically small, generalist, and adaptable. They didn't need much to get by. They could hide. They could burrow. They could wait. And then there were the birds. Technically, birds are dinosaurs, the last living lineage of a once mighty clade. Their ancestors had already developed beaks, feathers, and flight. Some of them, tucked away in remote forests or coastal marshes, managed to hang on through the worst of the fallout. From those few survivors, every robin, eagle, and hummingbird alive today is descended. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, also known as the KPG event, was a punctuation mark in Earth's history, not just an ending but a turning point. It closed the long chapter of non-avian dinosaur dominance and opened the door for mammals to rise. With so many ecological niches suddenly vacant, the survivors evolved rapidly. Mammals diversified, spread out, and began to shape the world in entirely new ways. In the geologic record, the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods is marked by a thin layer of clay enriched with iridium, a metal that is rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids. This layer is found all over the world, from the cliffs of Denmark to the plains of North America to the deep-sea sediments of the Pacific. It's Earth's way of filing the event under important, leaving a dusty extraterrestrial bookmark at the end of an era. It's hard not to feel a strange sense of awe at the scale of this event. One moment, one rock, changed the course of life for the entire planet. Had the asteroid missed Earth by even a few hours, it might have plunged harmlessly into the ocean, and the age of dinosaurs might never have ended. Mammals might have remained small and obscure. Humans might never have evolved. But the asteroid didn't miss. It hit, and the sky fell. And in that collapse, a new world began. The world didn't end when the asteroid hit. Not entirely, but it came breathtakingly close. In the long story of life on Earth, there are moments when the page doesn't just turn, it gets scorched. The impact that marked the end of the Cretaceous was one of those moments. In an instant, the age of dinosaurs collapsed, and a new chapter, bleaker but full of strange promise, began. The first thing to vanish was the light. The aftermath of the Chicxulub impact wasn't just fire and tsunamis. As the dust, ash and aerosols from the impact spread through the atmosphere, the world was cast into shadow. Particles from vaporized rock, sulfates lofted into the stratosphere, and soot from global wildfires blanketed the skies. Sunlight dimmed dramatically. In many parts of the world, the skies would have been a permanent sickly twilight. For weeks, months, or even years, photosynthesis ground to a halt. With sunlight gone, Earth grew cold. Not an ice age in the traditional sense, but a sudden and severe global chill. The temperature drops stressed ecosystems already reeling from the fires, the acid rain, and the seismic chaos of the impact. Plants withered. Plankton populations, which formed the base of the marine food web, collapsed. On land, leafy forests turned skeletal and silent. For animals, especially those dependent on complex ecosystems or large body sizes, the cold and dark were utterly unforgiving. Herbivores found no plants to eat. Carnivores found fewer and fewer prey. In the oceans, filter feeders starved as plankton blooms failed. Coral reefs, sensitive to temperature and chemistry changes, faded into ghosts. The intricate marine ecosystems that had evolved over tens of millions of years suddenly fell apart. It's tempting to picture the extinction as a single dramatic moment, a fiery blast, a shuddering quake, and then silence. But the truth is messier and more tragic. The impact was only the beginning. What followed was a slow unravelling, a planetary systemed failure in real time. It was not one moment, but many, an extinction by 1,000 paper cuts. And yet, in the shadow of disaster, life endured. The creatures that made it through this grim bottleneck were not the rulers of the old world. They weren't the towering dinosaurs or the giant marine reptiles. They were the small, the adaptable, and the unassuming. Tiny mammals, for instance, had already been around for tens of millions of years. During the Mesozoic, they had lived in the margins, scurrying in the underbrush, hunting insects, nesting in burrows. They weren't flashy, but they were resourceful, and when the asteroid hit, that skill set paid off. Many mammals likely sheltered underground or in rock crevices, places where the blast winds and firestorms could not reach. Their small size meant they required less food. Their varied diets, everything from seeds to insects to carrion, gave them flexibility in a world where food was suddenly scarce. Some may have hibernated or entered states of torpor, conserving energy until conditions improved. Their physiology also offered an edge. Mammals are warm-blooded, meaning they can regulate their body temperature. In a rapidly cooling world, that was a life-saving trait. While cold-blooded reptiles struggled with the dropping temperatures and limited sunlight, mammals could stay active, hunt at night, and maintain internal stability. Birds too had their moment. Technically speaking, they are the only dinosaurs that survived, but not all birds made it. The large, specialized species of the Cretaceous, those with narrow diets or complex nesting habits, vanished along with their non-avian cousins. The survivors were small, generalist, ground-dwelling species. Some may have eaten seeds, which can persist long after plants die. Others may have survived by foraging on detritus or small insects. Their feathers helped insulate them from the cold, and many could fly to find new shelter or food sources. It's strange to think that from these scrappy, soot-covered survivors came everything from house sparrows to ostriches to penguins. But that's what mass extinctions do. They prune the tree of life so severely that what regrows is often unexpected. Evolution doesn't follow a script. It works with what's left. The oceans too saw a massive reset. With plankton decimated and marine reptiles wiped out, it was a long and slow road to recovery. Some bony fish persisted, as did certain sharks and rays. deep-sea creatures, shielded from the chaos at the surface, likely experienced less disruption. But in the sunlit zones, the world had to start over. Coral reefs eventually returned, though it took millions of years. Marine mammals would not arrive on the scene until much later, but the open waters were already preparing the stage. On land, the ecosystems that emerged from the ashes looked very different. The towering ferns and conifers that had dominated the Mesozoic were joined by a new botanical revolution. Flowering plants. Angiosperms had already been around for a while, but with the extinction of their competitors, they exploded in diversity. Grasses, trees with the blossoms, fruit-bearing shrubs, all began to reshape the land in colour and complexity. With new plants came new herbivores. Mammals began to diversify quickly, filling in the ecological roles once held by dinosaurs. Some grew larger, some became more specialised, and others developed entirely new ways of living. Primates, hoofed animals, rodents, and carnivores all began their slow rise during this period. It wasn't an overnight explosion, but a steady and determined march into the void left by the Great Extinction. It's a humbling thought. The world we know today is built on the bones of another. The forests we walk through, the birds in the sky, the mammals we are, all came about because of one cataclysmic day 66 million years ago. Without that asteroid, the Earth might still be ruled by dinosaurs. Mammals might have remained small and nocturnal, and humans, we might never have existed at all. But the asteroid came, the sky fell, and out of that darkness, a new world bloomed. It is a story of destruction, yes, but also of resilience, of nature's ability to start over, even when all seems lost. In the silence that followed the fires and the floods, something new stirred, something small, something determined, and slowly, quietly, life found its way forward again. When the dust finally settled and the sunlight returned, Earth was a different planet. The lush dinosaur-dominated ecosystems of the Mesozoic were gone, turned to ash and silence. In their place came something new, not overnight, but over the course of millions of years. What emerged from that devastation was not just a changed world, but the blueprint for the one you live in now. Start with the birds. Strange as it sounds, every sparrow, penguin, parrot and pigeon is a living dinosaur. They are the only lineage of dinosaurs that survived the mass extinction, the last feathered echoes of a lost empire. And they didn't just survive, they flourished. With their toothless beaks, hollow bones and warm-blooded metabolism, birds were built for resilience. In a world where most large animals had perished, being small, light and mobile turned out to be a winning formula. Some birds likely survived because they could eat seeds, which persisted long after plants died. Others might have weathered the cold in burrows or in more temperate zones. Either way, the birds that made it through the KPG extinction eventually radiated into the thousands of species we see today. They learned to sing, to soar, to dive into oceans, and to peck crumbs off city sidewalks. In a sense, the world is still a dinosaur's playground, just a very different kind of dinosaur. And then, of course, there were the mammals. Before the extinction event, mammals were mostly small and nocturnal. They lived in the margins, darting through the underbrush while the thunderous feet of dinosaurs passed overhead. But after the impact, the rules changed. With most of the dominant reptilian megafauna wiped out, the ecological field was wide open. This was the mammals' moment, and they took it. In the aftermath, mammalian evolution kicked into high gear. Lineages began branching out into a wide variety of forms. Some took to the trees, developing grasping limbs and stereoscopic vision, the first primates. Others moved into open grasslands, evolving speed and grazing teeth. Some became expert diggers, swimmers or climbers. Whales returned to the sea, bats took to the skies. Elephants grew tusks and trunks. Cats, dogs, bears, rodents and apes all found their way forward. This wasn't just random chaos, it was the evolutionary equivalent of musical chairs. After the big extinction, nature didn't just hand out new opportunities. it demanded rapid innovation. Traits like live birth, fur for insulation, and the ability to regulate body temperature gave mammals an edge. So did their relatively large brains, which helped them adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Intelligence, it turns out, is a pretty decent survival tool, and somewhere along this unfolding story, still many millions of years after the asteroid, came humans. Descended from primates who once swung through Eocene forests, we are the product of one evolutionary gamble after another. Our opposable thumbs, social behaviours, language skills, and oversized brains are all part of a lineage that rose not in spite of catastrophe, but because of it. It's a strange and slightly humbling truth. Your very existence, your ability to lie in bed and listen to a sleepy science video, hinges on not one but 5 mass extinction events. Each one reshaped the planet. Each one tore down ecosystems and forced life to start again from a narrower base. And each time the survivors, often the overlooked, the fringe dwellers, the underdogs, became the founders of a new era. Without the Ordovician Silurian extinction, vertebrates may never have evolved the diversity to colonize land. Without the Devonian crisis, early tetrapods may never have stepped out of the swamps. Without the Great Dang at the end of the Permian, the archosaurs, ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodiles, might not have gotten their shot. And without the Triassic-Jurassic turnover, dinosaurs themselves might have remained small, obscure reptiles rather than ruling the world for over 150 million years. Finally, without that particularly rude asteroid 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs would still be roaming the Earth, and mammals might still be hiding in the underbrush, nibbling bugs and berries in the shadows. There would be no moon landings, no Renaissance, no coffee, no jazz, no internet, no bedtime videos explaining the 5 times the world almost ended. In a cosmic sense, it's a bit absurd that the end of one world creates space for another. But that's the cycle. Mass extinction isn't the final chapter. It's a clearing of the stage. Painful, yes. Brutal, absolutely. But also oddly creative. Evolution doesn't mourn the lost. It builds from what's left. Every extinction has left a fingerprint on today's ecosystems. The coral reefs, the grasslands, the rainforests, the tundras, they all bear the marks of what came before and what never came back. Even now we live among ghosts. Horseshoe crabs scuttle through the surf with bodies nearly unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Ginkgo trees wave fan-shaped leaves that once shaded Jurassic sauropods. And deep in our own DNA, there are whispers from creatures that survived in the shadows, furred, burrowing, quietly determined to outlast catastrophe. It's worth remembering too that extinction is not just an ancient tale. Today, biodiversity is under pressure again, from habitat loss, climate change, pollution, and overexploitation. Species are vanishing at rates far above background levels. Scientists warn we may be entering a 6th mass extinction, this time caused not by volcanoes or asteroids, but by one particularly clever species of primate. But there's a silver lining in knowing the past. The fossil record isn't just a list of losses, it's a guide to resilience. It shows us how life comes back, how diversity returns, and how the small and the quiet sometimes end up shaping the future. And perhaps with that knowledge, we can choose a path that preserves more of what we have, rather than letting it slip into memory. So as you drift off tonight, think about this. The forests you've walked through, the animals you've seen, even the fact that you're here at all of it came not in spite of catastrophe, but because of it. Life doesn't just endure, it transforms. And sometimes the ashes of one world are the soil of the next. Mass extinctions don't usually send out invitations, they arrive unannounced. Sometimes in a slow, suffocating whisper, other times with a planet-shaking roar. And in their wake, the Earth is never quite the same. We followed the story of 5 such cataclysms, moments when life itself was pushed to the brink, ecosystems unraveled, and evolution was forced to reboot. Each one left behind a transformed world. Each one reminded us that life, for all its beauty and complexity, is also remarkably vulnerable. In the Ordovician Silurian extinction, it was an icy grip that squeezed life in the oceans, drawing sea levels down and oxygen out. Then came the Devonian crisis, a long, uneven slide into loss, likely nudged by forests and their unexpected influence on the oceans. The Permian-Triassic extinction, the worst of them all, nearly sterilized the planet with volcanic fire and atmospheric chaos. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction knocked down the remaining competitors, giving dinosaurs their window. And finally, the Chicxulub impact, a single moment of unimaginable violence, cleared the way for mammals and eventually for us. It's easy to focus on the destruction. The statistics alone are staggering. 90% of marine species lost here, 70% of vertebrates gone there. Entire clades vanished without a trace. Some creatures that once ruled the seas or walked the land were reduced to fossil fragments and mystery. But this isn't just a story of endings. Each extinction, as ruthless as it was, also sparked creation. Not in a conscious or moral sense, nature isn't sentimental, but in a raw, unflinching evolutionary way. When ecosystems collapse, they leave space behind, and evolution, like water, finds a way to fill every crack. Out of those 5 collapses came astonishing innovation. Jawed fish, land-walking tetrapods, flowering plants, birds, mammals, whales, primates, all rose from the ashes of what came before. Life, when stripped to its essentials, has a habit of getting inventive. But now we find ourselves in a curious place. We are no longer just passengers in Earth's great experiment. We are participants, and increasingly we are influencers. Many scientists believe we are currently in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, one driven not by volcanoes or asteroids, but by the cumulative impact of human activity. Species are disappearing faster than new ones can emerge. Forests are shrinking. Coral reefs are bleaching. The climate is changing at a rate not seen in millions of years, and all of this is happening during what should be a golden age of knowledge and possibility. This is not said to alarm, but to reflect. Because unlike ammonites or trilobites or woolly mammoths, we have the power to recognize what's happening. And perhaps more importantly, we have the power to choose a different outcome. It begins with understanding, knowing that life on Earth is not guaranteed, that stability is a temporary gift, helps us treat it with the care it deserves. The fossil record is a reminder etched in stone that no species, no matter how mighty, is immune to change. Even the mighty Tyrannosaurus had its last day. But if there's one theme that has echoed through every extinction and every recovery, it's resilience. Life returns. It may take millions of years. It may look completely different, but the spark reignites. Microbes bubble up from deep vents. Ferns crack through volcanic ash. Small mammals blink their eyes and scurry into a changed world ready to begin again. There's a softness to that thought, especially as you lie here in the quiet of your own room, your own time. The stars above us have seen it all. They watched the asteroid fall, the continents split, the forests bloom, and the glaciers grind down mountains. And now they watch us. We are stardust that learn to think, to wonder, to worry, and to hope. And that means we can choose. We can choose to protect what remains, to reduce the harm we cause, and to pass on a richer world than the one we inherited. It won't be easy. Extinction, even when unintentional, is a heavy thing to push back against. But knowing the stakes makes the effort worth it. Tonight, as you drift off, maybe your mind will linger on trilobites and ammonites, on fern-covered landscapes and lava fields, on birds that survived firestorms and mammals that crept from burrows into a brave new world. Maybe you'll wonder, quietly, what traces of our time will remain in the distant future, and who or what might read them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember how deeply improbable it is that you exist at all, that your world with its trees and oceans and music and cats and coffee is the result of 5 enormous resets, 5 endings, 5 new beginnings, and through all of it, life carried on. Before we say goodnight, I'd like to ask again, Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Are the stars out? Or is the sun just beginning to rise? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. If this journey through extinction has helped you relax, learn something new, or just fall gently asleep, I'd love for you to tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know where in the world you are. It helps this sleepy little corner of the internet keep growing. And if this video turned out to be too interesting to sleep through, well, at least you've learned something. That's always a win. Sleep well and remember, even in the darkest times, life finds a way forward. And sometimes, the quietest moments echo through the longest stretches of time.